Part 3, Swann in Love, Section 6. More important, perhaps, was a second visit which he paid her, a little later. On his way to the house, as always when he knew that they were to meet, he formed a picture of her in his mind, and the necessity, if he was to find any beauty in her face, of fixing his eyes on the fresh and rosy protuberance of her cheek bones, and of shutting out all the rest of those cheeks, which were so often languorous and sallow, except when they were punctuated with little fiery spots, plunged him in acute depression, as proving that one's ideal is always unattainable, and one's actual happiness mediocre. He was taking her an engraving which she had asked to see. She was not very well. She received him wearing a wrapper of mauve crêpe de chine, which draped her bosom like a mantle, with a richly embroidered web. As she stood there beside him, brushing his cheek with the loosened tresses of her hair, bending one knee in what was almost a dancer's pose, so that she could lean without tiring herself over the picture at which she was gazing, with bended head, out of those great eyes, which seemed so weary and so sullen when there was nothing to animate her, Swann was struck by her resemblance to the figure of Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, which is to be seen in one of the Sistine frescoes. He had always found a peculiar fascination in tracing in the paintings of the old masters, not merely the general characteristics of the people whom he encountered in his daily life, but rather what seems least susceptible of generalization, the individual features of men and women whom he knew, as, for instance, in a bust of the Doge Loredan by Antonio Rizzo, the prominent cheek-bones, the slanting eyebrows, in short, a speaking likeness to his own coachman Rémi; in the coloring of a Ghirlandaio, the nose of M. de Palancy; in a portrait by Tintoretto, the invasion of the plumpness of the cheek by an outcrop of whisker, the broken nose, the penetrating stare, the swollen eyelids of Dr. Du Bourbon. Perhaps because he had always regretted in his heart that he had confined his attention to the social side of life, had talked always rather than acted, he felt that he might find a sort of indulgence bestowed upon him by those great artists, in his perception of the fact that they also had regarded with pleasure, and had admitted into the canon of their works such types of physiognomy as give those works the strongest possible certificate of reality and trueness to life, a modern, almost a topical savor. Perhaps also he had so far succumbed to the prevailing frivolity of the world of fashion, that he felt the necessity of finding in an old masterpiece some such obvious and refreshing allusion to a person about whom jokes could be made and repeated and enjoyed today. Perhaps, on the other hand, he had retained enough of the artistic temperament to be able to find a genuine satisfaction in watching these individual features take on a more general significance when he saw them, uprooted and disembodied, in the abstract idea of similarity between an historic portrait and a modern original, whom it was not intended to represent. However that might be, and perhaps because the abundance of impressions which he for some time past had been receiving, though indeed they had come to him rather through the channel of his appreciation of music, had enriched his appetite for painting as well, it was with an unusual intensity of pleasure, a pleasure destined to have a lasting effect upon his character and conduct, that Swann remarked Odette's resemblance to the Zipporah of that Alessandro Germariano, to whom one shrinks from giving his more popular surname, now that Botticelli suggests not so much the actual work of the master as that false and banal conception of it which has of late obtained common currency. He no longer based his estimate of the merit of Odette's face on the more or less good quality of her cheeks, and the softness and sweetness, as of carnation petals, which, he supposed, would greet his lips there should he ever hazard an embrace, but regarded it rather as a skein of subtle and lovely silken threads, which his gazing eyes collected and wound together, following the curving line from the skein to the ball, where he mingled the cadence of her neck with the spring of her hair and the droop of her eyelids, as though from a portrait of herself in which her type was made clearly intelligible. He stood gazing at her. Traces of the old fresco were apparent in her face and limbs, and these he tried incessantly afterwards to recapture, both when he was with Odette and when he was only thinking of her in her absence. and, albeit his admiration for the Florentine masterpiece was probably based upon his discovery that it had been reproduced in her, the similarity enhanced her beauty also, and rendered her more precious in his sight. Swann reproached himself with his failure hitherto to estimate at her true worth a creature whom the great Sandro would have adored, and counted himself fortunate that his pleasure in the contemplation of Odette found a justification in his own system of aesthetic. He told himself that, in choosing the thought of Odette as the inspiration of his dreams of ideal happiness, he was not, as he had until then supposed, falling back merely upon an expedition of doubtful and certainly inadequate value, since she contained in herself what satisfied the utmost refinement of his taste in art. He failed to observe that this quality would not naturally avail to bring Odette into the category of women whom he found desirable, simply because his desires had always run counter to his aesthetic taste. The words Florentine painting were invaluable to Swann. They enabled him, gave him, as it were, a legal title, to introduce the image of Odette into a world of dreams and fancies, which, until then, she had been debarred from entering, and where she assumed a new and nobler form. And whereas the mere sight of her in the flesh, by perpetually reviving his misgivings as to the quality of her face, her figure, the whole of her beauty, used to cool the ardor of his love, those misgivings were swept away, and that love confirmed, now that he could re-erect his estimate of her on the sure foundations of his aesthetic principles; while the kiss, the bodily surrender, which would have seemed natural and but moderately attractive had they been granted him by a creature of somewhat withered flesh and sluggish blood, coming, as now they came, to crown his adoration of a masterpiece in a gallery, must, it seemed, prove as exquisite as they would be supernatural. And when he was tempted to regret that for months past he had done nothing but visit Odette, he would assure himself that he was not unreasonable in giving up much of his time to the study of an inestimably precious work of art, cast for once in a new, a different, and especially charming metal, in an unmatched exemplar which he would contemplate at one moment with the humble, spiritual, disinterested mind of an artist, at another with the pride, the selfishness, the sensual thrill of a collector. On his study table at which he worked he had placed, as it were a photograph of Odette, a reproduction of Jethro's daughter. He would gaze in admiration at the large eyes, the delicate features in which the imperfection of her skin might be surmised, the marvelous locks of hair that fell along her tired cheeks, and, adapting what he had already felt to be beautiful on aesthetic grounds to the idea of a living woman, he converted it into a series of physical merits which he congratulated himself on finding assembled in the person of one whom he might ultimately possess. The vague feeling of sympathy which attracts a spectator to a work of art, now that he knew the type, in warm flesh and blood, of Jethro's daughter, became a desire which more than compensated thenceforward for that with which Odette's physical charms had at first failed to inspire him. When he had sat for a long time gazing at the Botticelli, he would think of his own living Botticelli, who seemed all the lovelier in contrast, and as he drew towards him the photograph of Zipporah, he would imagine that he was holding Odette against his heart. It was not only Odette's indifference, however, that he must take pains to circumvent. It was also not infrequently his own. Feeling that, since Odette had had every facility for seeing him, she seemed no longer to have very much to say to him when they did meet, he was afraid lest the manner, at once trivial, monotonous, and seemingly unalterable, which she now adopted when they were together, should ultimately destroy in him that romantic hope, that a day might come when she would make avowal of her passion, by which hope alone he had become and would remain her lover. And so to alter, to give a fresh moral aspect to that Odette, of whose unchanging mood he was afraid of growing weary, he wrote suddenly a letter full of hinted discoveries and feigned indignation, which he sent off so that it should reach her before dinner time. He knew that she would be frightened, and that she would reply, and he hoped that when the fear of losing him clutched at her heart, it would force from her words such as he had never yet heard her utter. And he was right. By repeating this device he had won from her the most affectionate letters that she had, so far, written him, One of them, which she had sent to him at midday by a special messenger from the Maison Dorée, it was the day of the Paris Murcie fête, given for the victims of the recent floods in Murcia, beginning, "My dear, my hand trembles so that I can scarcely write," and these letters he had kept in the same drawer as the withered chrysanthemum. Or else, if she had not had time to write, when he arrived at the Verdurands, she would come running up to him with an "I've something to say to you," and he would gaze curiously at the revelation in her face and speech of what she had hitherto kept concealed from him of her heart. Even as he drew near to the Verdurand's door, and caught sight of the great lamplit spaces of the drawing-room windows, whose shutters were never closed, he would begin to melt at the thought of the charming creature whom he would see as he entered the room, basking in that golden light. Here and there the figures of the guests stood out, sharp and black, between lamp and window, shutting off the light, like those little pictures which one sees sometimes pasted here and there upon a glass screen, whose other panes are mere transparencies. He would try to make out Odette, and then, when he was once inside, without thinking, his eyes sparkled suddenly with such radiant happiness that Monsieur Verdurin said to the painter, seems to be getting warm." Indeed, her presence gave the house what none other of the houses that he visited seemed to possess, a sort of tactual sense, a nervous system which ramified into each of its rooms and sent a constant stimulus to his heart. And so the simple and regular manifestations of a social organism, namely the little clan, were transformed for Swann into a series of daily encounters with Odette, and enabled him to feign indifference to the prospect of seeing her, or even a desire not to see her, in doing which he incurred no very great risk, since, even although he had written to her during the day, he would of necessity see her in the evening and accompany her home. But one evening, when, irritated by the thought of that inevitable dark drive together, he had taken his other little girl all the way to the Bois, so as to delay as long as possible the moment of his appearance at the Verdurins', he was so late in reaching them that Odette, supposing that he did not intend to come, had already left. Seeing the room bare of her, Swann felt his heart wrung by sudden anguish. He shook with the sense that he was being deprived of a pleasure whose intensity he began then for the first time to estimate, having always hitherto had that certainty of finding it whenever he would, which, as in the case of all our pleasures, reduced if it did not altogether blind him to its dimensions. "Did you notice the face he pulled when he saw that she wasn't here?" Monsieur Verdurin asked his wife. "I think we may say that he's hooked." "The face he pulled!" exploded Dr. Cottard, who, having left the house for a moment to visit a patient, had just returned to fetch his wife and did not know whom they were discussing. "Do you mean to say you didn't meet him on the doorstep, the loveliest of swans?" "No. Monsieur Swann has been here?" "Just for a moment. We had a glimpse of a swan tremendously agitated, in a state of nerves. You see, Odette had left." "You mean to say that she has gone the whole hog with him, that she has burned her boats?" inquired the doctor cautiously, testing the meaning of his phrases. "Why, of course not. There's absolutely nothing in it. In fact, between you and me, I think she's making a great mistake and behaving like a silly little fool, which she is, incidentally." "Come, come, come," said Monsieur Verdurin. "How on earth do you know that there's nothing in it? We haven't been there to see, have we now?" "She would have told me," answered Madame Verdurin with dignity. "I may say that she tells me everything. As she has no one else at present, I told her that she ought to live with him. She makes out that she can't. She admits she was immensely attracted by him at first, but he's always shy with her, and that makes her shy with him. Besides, she doesn't care for him in that way, she says. It's an ideal love, platonic, you know. She's afraid of rubbing the bloom off. Oh, I don't know half the things she says. How should I? And yet he's exactly the sort of man she wants." "I beg to differ from you," Monsieur Verdurin courteously interrupted. "I am only half satisfied with the gentleman. I feel that he poses." Madame Verdurin's whole body stiffened, her eyes stared blankly as though she had suddenly been turned into a statue, a device by means of which she might be supposed not to have caught the sound of that unutterable word which seemed to imply that it was possible for people to pose in her house, and therefore that there were people in the world who mattered more than herself. "Anyhow, if there is nothing in it, I don't suppose it's because our friend believes in her virtue. And yet, you never know, he seems to believe in her intelligence. I don't know whether you heard the way he lectured her the other evening about Von Toya's sonata. I am devoted to Odette, but really, to expound theories of aesthetic to her, the man must be a prize idiot." "Look here, I won't have you saying nasty things about Odette," broke in Madame Verdurin in her spoiled child manner. "She is charming." "There's no reason why she shouldn't be charming. We are not saying anything nasty about her, only that she is not the embodiment of either virtue or intellect. After all," he turned to the painter, "does it matter so very much whether she is virtuous or not? You can't tell. She might be a great deal less charming if she were." On the landing Swann had run into the Verdurins' butler, who had been somewhere else a moment earlier when he arrived, and who had been asked by Odette to tell Swann, but that was at least an hour ago, that she would probably stop to drink a cup of chocolate at Prévost's on her way home. Swann set off at once for Prévost's, but every few yards his carriage was held up by others or by people crossing the street. Loathsome obstacles, each of which he would gladly have crushed beneath his wheels, were it not that a policeman fumbling with a notebook would delay him even longer than the actual passage of the pedestrian. He counted the minutes feverishly, adding a few seconds to each so as to be quite certain that he had not given himself short measure, and so possibly exaggerated whatever chance there might actually be of his arriving at Prévost's in time, and of finding her still there. And then in a moment of illumination, like a man in a fever, who awakes from sleep and is conscious of the absurdity of the dream shapes among which his mind has been wandering, without any clear distinction between himself and them, Swann suddenly perceived how foreign to his nature were the thoughts which he had been revolving in his mind ever since he had heard at the Verdurins' that Odette had left; how novel the heartache from which he was suffering, but of which he was only now conscious as though he had just woken up. What? All this disturbance simply because he would not see Odette now till tomorrow, exactly what he had been hoping not an hour before as he drove toward Madame Verdurin's? He was obliged to admit also that now, as he sat in the same carriage and drove to Prévost's, he was no longer the same man, was no longer alone even, but that a new personality was there beside him, adhering to him, amalgamated with him, a creature from whom he might, perhaps, be unable to liberate himself, towards whom he might have to adopt some such stratagem as one uses to outwit a master or a malady. And yet, during this last moment in which he had felt that another, a fresh personality was thus conjoined with his own, life had seemed somehow more interesting. It was in vain that he assured himself that this possible meeting at Prévost's, the tension of waiting for which so ravished, stripped so bare the intervening moments that he could find nothing, not one idea, not one memory in his mind, beneath which his troubled spirit might take shelter and repose, would probably, after all, should it take place, be much the same as all their meetings, of no great importance. As on every other evening, once he was in Odette's company, once he had begun to cast furtive glances at her changing countenance, and instantly to withdraw his eyes, lest she should read in them the first symbols of desire, and believe no more in his indifference, he would cease to be able even to think of her, so busy would he be in the search for pretexts which would enable him not to leave her immediately, and to assure himself, without betraying his concern, that he would find her again next evening at the Verdurins'. Pretexts, that is to say, which would enable him to prolong for the time being, and to renew for one day more, the disappointment, the torturing deception that must always come to him with the vain presence of this woman, whom he might approach, yet never dared embrace. End of Part 3, Section 6.